Arkane Studios are known for putting a lot of fun Easter eggs and secrets all over their games. But probably one of my favorites is one from Prey where we can find this adorable fella. Found in the offices next to the atrium in the hardware labs, this lovable glue snowman can be found hidden in a back corner behind an assortment of office whiteboards and stacks of boxes. And on him, he has a simple note that reads, "Hello, my name is Mr. Gluey McGlueface." Oh bro, we're putting this in the iceberg. You guys were asking why everyone had gloves? This is why. Look, boys, they're making little Mr. Gluey McGlue faces. Probably the best character I've met so far. Besides myself, obviously, I'm awesome. It looks like nothing more than a funny nod from the developers, and it was likely something constructed by the scientists on Talos 1 at some point as a fun gag using some of the tech they were developing. One interesting thing I noticed though is that Mr. Glueface's hands are actually baseball gloves, one of the trash items we find on dozens of dead bodies around the space station, and this makes me wonder if Mr. Gluey McGlueface may actually be hiding an army of offspring we just haven't found yet. Either way, he is my vote for best character in the game. Prey has what I think is one of the best introductions to a video game I have ever played, and at the very start of that, it takes us on a helicopter ride across a sprawling and futuristic city where we get to see a happy glimpse into what is about to become a horrible nightmare. But what a lot of players probably missed while on this helicopter ride is a one-frame glitch near the start of the endeavor where most players probably wrote it off as a technical issue, if they did happen to even see it at all. However, if we freeze frame on that one frame, we can actually see this, which is not a glitch in the game, but actually a very purposeful moment. As you can see, the helicopter is still perfectly in frame unaltered, with only the view outside becoming a blue sea of nothingness. You see, this is what happens when the looking glass, which is a piece of tech in-game that projects anything onto a piece of glass making it look real, happens to glitch out. And as we learn only moments after this helicopter ride ends, the entire thing was fake, and instead you were in this room here surrounded by this looking glass tech being tricked into thinking you were still on Earth. So it's crazy to think that even before the big reveal happened at the start of Prey, we were being given these small hints as to what was really going on. And if you go back and start to play this intro with this new knowledge, you will start to also notice other things as well, like why the helipad is a specific size with the walls too high to climb that aren't made of real stone, but actually glass. As is common with games that don't reach astounding amounts of financial success, Arkane Studios was never able to develop all of the post-launch content they wanted to for Prey. Luckily for us though, the one big piece of DLC content we did get, Moon Crash, ended up being quite literally the best and most underrated DLC for any game of all time, at least in my opinion. What a lot of players don't know though is that there are some very strong indications there was a second DLC originally planned, and it sounds amazing. You see, in the game's files, there are two books that have in their unique identifiers a reference to DLC hooks, with one being named DLC_hook 4 Moonbase, and the other being named DLC_hook 1 Secret Space Station. One of these books, titled in-game Pioneers of Space Industry, tells the story of researchers on a moon base codenamed Pythias, and this turned out to be exactly what the Moon Crash DLC was about. But what about that other book? Titled Flight Log Scott Parker, it details what would have likely been the other planned Prey DLC we never got, and boy does it sound cool. Earth liftoff was at 0900, conditions nominal, pre-check certified, 4 executive passengers, mail cargo. Flight was uneventful until 11:33 when radar detected an unidentified shuttle approximately 30 degrees off flight path at 9,000 kilometers. Its drift and rotation indicated malfunctioning maneuvering thrusters. There was no answer to radio calls. Captain Cooper ordered a course adjustment to bring us alongside. As we maneuvered within 60 kilometers, a second shuttle appeared on radar in the vicinity of the drifting vessel. Transponders identified it as a military vessel. We received a radio message to resume our original heading immediately. Captain Cooper asked if assistance was required, and the order from the military shuttle was repeated. All highly unusual, but then it got really strange. The captain spotted it first. There was a facility out there and it was running absolutely dark. No lights, radar transparent. We were too far to see any details, but it was big. Cooper snapped into action, punched in a course to Talos and fired the engines. We moved out as quickly as possible. Our passengers were clueless to the entire encounter. Our arrival at Talos went by smoothly and the passengers and cargo were delivered safely. So what exactly was this supposed military ship that the Earthflight came into contact with? And even more hauntingly, why were there no signals of life on board? Especially considering that they did in fact receive a transmission that would imply that other humans were captaining the vessel. But the whole ordeal just sounds terrifying, and even more so interesting. Potentially this could have been a horror DLC planned for Prey that would have taken us to an abandoned space station full of zombified humans, and potentially some new Typhon organisms that had caused the chaos. Or maybe it would have just expanded the Prey lore more. After all, why is there a military vessel coming into contact with the ships headed to Talos 1 in the first place? Could it be that the governments on Earth are trying to spy on Transstar? Either way, it's sad that this DLC and the ideas the devs had for it will likely never see the light of day, with our only hope being that a sequel to Prey eventually gets announced and this abandoned and scary military ship idea can maybe make a comeback. And hey, I won't complain, considering just how good Moon Crash is, even on its own. We already talked about the passwords to Morgan's personal computer and office and why they are special, but potentially the best password of all relating to Morgan comes from his secretary. You see, if you take a short detour on your way to Morgan's office in game, right outside the front door is a computer and desk set up for his secretary. If you actually try to use the computer though, it's password protected, and at this point in the game you likely don't have the necessary hacking skill to get in. Luckily for us though, there happens to be a sticky note right on the side of the monitor with the password to the computer, and if we open it up we are met with the now infamous OMG Hot Boss. If it wasn't clear already, Morgan gets bitches. And I'm sure that our secretary isn't the only person on Talos 1 with an eye for Transstar's youngest son. God, we're hot. Prey is a game all about freedom and creating your own story and gameplay. It's what makes it one of the best games ever. And because of that, there's a lot of cool and interesting little quirks in terms of what you can do in the story and how it changes dialogues and moments around you. And one of my personal favorite examples of this is breaking into Alex's office early. You see, near the end of the main story, you make your way to your older brother's offices in an attempt to talk to him and finally hear out everything he has to say about what is going on. But especially ingenuitive players may have actually found a way into the office beforehand. This can be done with parkour, the glue gun, hacking grav shifts, or just finding some undiscovered path to the office at the top of the Arboretum. But if you do in fact break in, you are met with some hidden dialogue from Alex Yu. And even more interestingly, if you actually break his prized statue in his room, you hear this.
That statue was worth a lot of money, Morgan. I'm going to be charitable and assume you scuffled with a Typhon and didn't just break it out of spite.
It's cool that the game can react to the player going off the beaten path, and whenever people ask me why Prey is one of my favorite games of all time, explaining situations like this is the perfect way to put it. If you are ever watching a playthrough of Prey and want to immediately get an idea of where someone's at in the game, look for how much coral there is everywhere. The more there is, the closer towards the end they are. For those that don't know, coral is a strange orange-like structure produced by the Weaver Typhons that, based on all the research on Talos 1, seems to be a neural network of sorts from which they all communicate. It's actually this massive amount of coral that is the result of the summoning of the Apex Typhon at the end of the game, which we get to watch completely take over the station and send the Arboretum into 0G. But as to what exactly this coral substance is and how it works, we still aren't exactly sure. We do have this picture from a recent Prey art book collection though, which describes the entire process the Typhon used to take over other species, but even here we don't get any super in-depth explanations of coral itself. Rather, we just learn that the mimics kill and multiply, those mimics create new weavers, which create coral, phantoms, telepaths, and technopaths, all of which then defend the coral, after which the coral summons the apex to bring about chaos. We also know from events in game that the null wave device Alex Yu was working on was meant to stop this signal from the coral from ever reaching outside Typhon like the apex, but it seemingly fails to do so in the end, or it was used too late. The coral though, what seems to be the center of the Typhon nervous system, is never explained in depth, and it makes us begin to wonder how exactly this floating ball of energy leads to such powerful means of communication. Some in the community have even begun to speculate that coral is opening the actual space-time fabric of our universe to allow other beings to come through. Or it could even be a conduit for some sort of faster-than-light travel that can send things forward or back in time. Either way, it's just another mystery there's so much to learn about. In my opinion, Prey has one of, if not the best introduction sequences to a video game of all time, where a mysterious and relaxing day turns into a horrific and mind-bending twist. And in these beginning moments, at one point you enter a research facility where a group of scientists start to run a sequence of mundane tests on you before you presumably will be heading out into space. And in that last round of testing, right before a mimic appears and starts killing everyone, you are met with these two questions. A runaway train is bearing down on 5 people. You're standing on the platform next to an enormously fat man. Pushing him into the track will stop the train. Push the fat man, do nothing. Naturally, anyone with any sort of common sense and humor pushes the fat man here. But the next question only gets more crazy. A runaway train is bearing down on 5 people tied to a track. You could stop the train by jumping onto the track, but you would die. Jump on the tracks. Push the fat man. Do nothing. Once again, the obviously correct answer here is to push the fat man, but regardless of what you pick, only moments after, the real game of Prey begins. The more interesting part about this entire sequence though is just how much it relates to the game as a whole and its deeper meaning. Because you see, the entire game of Prey is really at its core a game about choices and empathy, and how every choice you make can have drastic consequences. The choices to these prompts early on are reflected in the themes of the game later, with options to either sacrifice yourself for the greater good or to cause chaos. And based on these choices, you will be judged in the final twist at the end of the game. In fact, there's even an achievement in the game called Push the Fat Man that players can get if they kill Alex Yu at the end of the game, which directly relates back to this questionnaire in Prey's opening. Where this connection starts to get absolutely insane though, is the real world parallel that almost no one knows about. Because you see, one of the founding members of Arkane Studios, the guys that made Prey, was actually the great-grandson of famous philosopher Philippa Foot, who originally created the now renowned thought experiment called the trolley problem, that this Prey questionnaire is based on. Why this relates specifically to Prey though, is because Philippa was a staunch supporter in her time of a cult called the Eternal Flame, based in northeastern Wyoming, that had actually been disbanded by an FBI raid following a horrific event where Philippa and other cult members were said to have sacrificed a group of overweight civilians via a train in order to... I'm just messing with you guys. Prey is a game full of different powers, many ways to play, and a variety of locations to check out. But just because the game has a lot to offer, doesn't also mean there isn't a lot of fascinating lost or cut content that never made it into the game in the first place. For example, in the game's files we can actually find tons of references to a massive gun called the Casivore. It would have been a talking gun that had a bloodthirsty yet polite demeanor, and fired multiple homing explosive discs that could fly around the map and find targets to discombobulate. After killing enemies, the gun would announce its own heroics, and we can even find many of these voice lines in the files to this day as placeholders.
Exiting slow wave sleep. No selector found. Framing new neural imprint. Imprint complete. Linking Casavor hybrodic munition system to selector MU. Casavor is awake.
On top of this too, the gun would have had an associated quest line, where at one point after killing too many enemies, the Casivore would have asked the player to recycle itself in shame, after which you could either recycle it, fix it by installing an empathy override so it would kill again, or simply installing it into the core of a medical operator instead. It honestly sounds like it would have been an awesome quest in game, but sadly it was cut midway through development due to the teams feeling like it didn't really add much to the story. Another example of this is the concept and the storyboard art we can see for players dual-wielding wrenches, which also was later determined to not be a worthwhile feature to work on. On the enemy's side, there were multiple ideas that were never used, like an etheric nightmare or cannibal typhons, which were supposedly mimics that would consume one another in order to create a greater phantom who was resistant to all damage types and had to be hit from behind. These cannibal typhons too were involved with cut neuromod content that would have given players the cannibal ability, which allowed them to eat typhon material or potentially even human corpses to regain health. Another interesting cut neuromod was called Smoke Form, which would have allowed players to transform into a black mist that could fly around the space station at breakneck speeds, but was cut because it just didn't fit the gameplay style well enough and was too OP. Like say the fast-paced teleporting in the Dishonored series, but on steroids. Overall, Prey is a type of game that excels in large part because of all of the options and freedom it gives you, and all the unexpected ways you can use your powers and abilities. And I hope one day if a sequel is made to this underrated underrated gem, these ideas can be pushed even further. While in theory Prey is a horror game of sorts, there aren't actually that many traditionally scary things in the game. Sure, the mimics and other monsters are terrifying at first, but that feeling wears off quickly once you learn how to deal with them. Most places are well lit, you have a lot of ways to fight the monsters, and there's almost no jump scares as long as you take the time to check every room. And by the way, I actually really like that. It adds suspense without being ridiculous like other games in the horror genre. The gameplay speaks for itself without relying too much on the scare factor. However, there is one moment in the game that most players on their first playthrough at least have never seen, that for me was by far the scariest thing in the entire story. If you head down into the director's office in Psychotronics, which is unlocked by revealing a secret door behind a wall and requires a specific keycard, you are met with a strange room that seems to have been for lounging. It's simply a square area surrounded by a looking glass screen with furniture in the middle, and on the screen opposite the entry, there's a small touch to calibrate button. It's a button that hasn't shown up on any of the other screens in game, so it catches your eye immediately. Sadly though, for players that can't help themselves touching this button over and over again as it moves across the screen, this eventually results in one of the worst jump scares of all time, followed by an attack from a phantom. Alright, let's calibrate this screen, chat. You know? Bro, dude, I knew that was coming and I still had a heart attack. For those of you who are unlucky enough to have stumbled upon this without knowing what was about to happen, I truly am sorry for the therapy you must be going through now. Mimics are not only the coolest and most interesting enemy in all of Prey, but also just one of the most fascinating in games in general. And the reason for this is their signature ability to transform into any object in the environment they see and hide in plain sight, only to pounce on the player once they get too close. But one big question revolving around these little guys is how do they even do this? And even more haunting, are they able to turn into more advanced things like, say, humans? First of all, on the topic of how mimics even transform, we can actually find a scientific research article in-game that states the following. Time to place your bets on how this actually works. My money is on number 2, obviously. Number 1, hallucinogenic field. Mimics project a field that causes observers to think they see the object. Number 2, pocket dimension. Mimics swap places with the object in a parallel universe, stays connected via wormhole. Number 3, transmutation. Mimic reconfigures its atoms and molecules while maintaining its own subjective consciousness. As for why the scientists on Talos 1 thought the pocket dimension theory was most likely, it comes down to other research logs and entries we can find later in game that explains how during testing on mimics, scientists found that objects and the mimics that turned into them themselves did not share any biological or cellular similarities, meaning the mimics were not just rearranging their molecular structure to appear like another thing. On top of this, when taking space-time signatures of the objects mimics turned into, the readings for the time movement and dilation did not match other objects that were real just beside them, implying that the things the mimics were turning into actually came from a separate pocket dimension on a different space-time continuum. In fact, some in the Prey community have even begun to speculate that the real reason the original aliens were able to travel through space so long to reach Earth's orbit was because they teleported into different pocket dimensions to slow down the progression of time and not die. Regardless though, as to how mimics actually change the environment around them is still a complete mystery, and they may be hiding even more secrets too. Because hidden in the datamined game files and released to some press agencies, there was at one point a very gruesome and horrific animation in-game that showed a mimic transforming into human beings. And while this was never implemented in-game, it seems to imply that at one point in development, this was an idea that was supposed to be added to the game. And if mimics do actually have the ability to copy not just inanimate objects, but humans too, could this mean that some of the people we talk to in-game were nothing more than aliens taking the form of a harmless human? This idea ties very well into the ending of the game and alien-human hybrids as well, and adds just an extra layer of intrigue to a story already criminally underanalyzed. If it isn't already clear enough, Arkane Studios loves to put hidden messages and meanings in even mundane and unassuming places, and specifically in Prey, this happens a lot in the passwords and codes. One of the coolest examples of this is the password to Alex Yu's computer in his office, which is Chenguoshen. I probably butchered that. For those of you that don't know, Chenguoshen is the name of a Chinese deity that was said to be the god of the moat and walls, or god of the boundary. This god was said to protect Chinese citizens in specific cities, villages, or towns from the dimensions of the afterlife that could wreak havoc, and served as a sort of god protecting the boundaries between dimensions and all those that serve them. This is a very specific analogy to use on Alex's password in-game, and may actually give us some clues to his character. Could this in fact be a hint that Alex is some sort of godlike figure, who has figured out how to bridge the gap between the Typhon's dimension and ours? Remember that poster in Morgan's room that seemed to give us a hint about the Typhon and where they came from? Well, in that poster, it looks a lot like they are bridging the gap between dimensions and breaking into ours, or at least that's one way to interpret it. And if that is the correct interpretation, then maybe Alex somehow played a role in bringing the Typhon to Earth. But how could that be the case if the Typhon are the ones that originally came to us? Well, maybe Alex is simply the final key they needed in order to bring on the advent of the Coral and Apex Typhon. And either way, it seems clear that Alex has some hidden intentions we still aren't fully clear on. To me at least, this password is a further hint that Alex is pulling a lot of the strings behind the entire story of Prey, more than most people in the community think, and he probably has a master plan to bridge the gap between dimensions and human-alien hybrids alike that people seldom talk about in-game, instead only being left to small hints. When walking around the Talos 1 space station in Prey or Pythias Moonbase in Mooncrash, you may have come across these weird machines often found in offices called reployers. They sort of look like a printer you would find in a regular office, but there's no real indication that they actually do anything of the sort. Modeled after the 1965 IBM 2540 card punch and read machines, the reployer simply sits in offices in-game and does nothing. And don't take my word for it. Even characters in game have no idea what they are used for. In fact, here's just one example of that from a note we can find from Sarah Elazar, Chief of Security. Remember, it's the Eradicator fabrication plan we want, not the reployer plan. No one knows what the hell a reployer is. So it's clear then that these strange devices aren't even understood by the people that have them. But then what exactly is their purpose in the first place? Well, some in the community think they may actually be some sort of secret monitoring device put in offices to watch employees, while others speculate it could be some weird social experiment to see what people do with an unknown object. After all, corruption and weird experiments are commonplace aboard Talos 1. The real answer though may lie in our real world, where in an interview Ricardo Bear, a senior game designer at Arkane Studios, had some interesting things to say about reployers in game. He explained that reployers originally started as a joke when one of the artists had made an asset in-game that no one could figure out what it was, so they asked them to remove it. But somehow it seemed like the reployer kept ending up in the game every day, even after multiple people were being told to remove it from the game entirely. And over time, this strange phenomenon became an inside joke at the studio, until it was decided the reployer could in fact stay in-game, something it likely would have done regardless. So what that really means though, is that literally no one, not us, not the characters, and not even the developers themselves, know what this thing is.